It was a stormy Friday night, the kind where the rain just doesn't stop. I was slogging through my shift as a pizza delivery guy, and after 3 solid hours on the road, my stomach was in knots. I desperately needed a bathroom break, but with orders pouring in and my boss cracking the whip, that was out of the question. When I finally grabbed the next order, the address took me to a desolate part of town. The streetlights were sparse, and the darkness seemed almost alive. My thoughts were tangled up in finding a bathroom as I drove through the rain, which pounded on my windshield like a relentless drum. Arriving at the house, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The place looked dark and ominous, with only a single flickering light illuminating the front porch. I parked and stepped out, clutching a pizza box like it was my lifeline. As I made my way up the driveway, something caught my eye. Movement in the bushes. My heart raced. Was it just the wind? Or was someone or something lurking there? I rang the doorbell, trying to ignore the creeping dread. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 30s, who looked as if she had seen a ghost. She seemed taken aback by the early delivery. "Hi, your pizza's here," I said, though my nerves were on edge. "That'll be $15. Her eyes darted past me, and her face turned a sickly shade of white. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice faltering. Her whisper was barely audible. "That's him. That's my ex. He's been stalking me for weeks." My stomach dropped. This was no ordinary delivery. "Do you have a phone? We need to call the police." She nodded, panic-stricken, and dashed back inside, leaving the door ajar. I stood there, exposed and vulnerable, every instinct screaming at me to stay alert. Moments later, she returned with her phone, trembling as she handed it to me. I quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher, keeping a wary eye on the bushes where the shadows danced menacingly. As we waited, the rain continued its relentless assault, punctuated by the occasional rustle from the bushes. Finally, the distinct sound of sirens pierced through the storm. Flashing police lights appeared, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. 2 officers emerged, one directing his flashlight towards us, while the other cautiously approached the bushes. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice steady but alert. I recounted the night's events, pointing towards the bushes where he had seen the unsettling movement. The officer signaled his partner, and together they advanced on the undergrowth. What felt like an eternity later, they dragged the struggling, yelling man from the bushes. It was clear he was the woman's ex-boyfriend. Relief washed over her as she sobbed. Thanking the officers profusely, they assured her he would be taken into custody and that she'd be safe for now. The police car with its captive drove off into the night. Turning back to me, the woman's eyes were filled with tears. "Thank you so much. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." I managed a weak smile, still reeling from the adrenaline. "I'm just glad you're okay. But, could I use your bathroom real quick?" She laughed, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Of course, come in." As I washed my hands, I reflected on how close we had come to disaster. I was just a pizza delivery guy, but tonight I had made a real difference. The darkness outside seemed a bit more menacing now, but I also felt a newfound strength. I had faced through danger and survived. When I returned to the pizza place, my boss eyed me curiously. "What took you so long?" he asked. "Crazy night," I shrugged, not ready to dive into the full story. As I headed out for the next delivery, a heightened sense of vigilance stayed with me. The dark streets and hidden corners held a new significance. I knew better now. Sometimes danger lurks in the shadows, and it's always best to stay alert, because you never know what might be hiding in the dark, and it's far better to be safe than sorry. I work as a delivery driver, and my shift starts at 10 p.m. A tough job, especially when the clock ticks past midnight. It is a demanding gig, but the pay is decent. On one particularly Friday night, the city was clogged in darkness and rain, adding an extra layer of eerie silence to the quiet streets I navigate. Around midnight, I received an order that took me to an unfamiliar part of town. The address seemed odd, and it took me a while to track it down. When I finally arrived, I found myself at the end of a long, unlit road. The house at the end looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Broken windows, peeling paint, and an oppressive air of neglect. A chill crawled up my spine, but I had a job to do. I parked my aging car and grabbed the food bag, trying to shake off the creeping unease. The silence was unnerving, No rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just an unsettling stillness. I approached the front door and knocked, but it creaked open on its own. Hesitant, I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. The house was pitch black, except for a few flickering candles that barely illuminated the hallway. The air was damp and frigid. As I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoed ominously. At the end, the door stood slightly ajar. "Bring it here," a voice called out, its tone so soft it was almost a whisper. I pushed open the door and entered the room. It was enveloped in darkness, save for a single candle casting sinister shadows on the walls. As my eyes adjusted, I felt a presence in the room with me. I could just make out a figure in the shadows, tall and gaunt with unnervingly long fingers. The figure stood into the candlelight, and I gasped. It was a woman, but her skin was unnatural pallid gray, and her eyes were deep, hollow pits. Her smile revealed sharp yellow teeth. "Thank you for bringing the food," she said, her voice now a raspy whisper that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Stay a while, won't you?" I took a step back, panic rising. I needed to go. "I have more deliveries," I stammered. She moved closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "No, stay. We rarely have visitors. It gets so lonely here." Desperation set in as I glanced around for an escape route. My phone was in my pocket, and a plan formed in my mind. I pulled it out, pretending to check for messages. "I have to go. My boss is calling," I lied, trying to sound as convincing as possible. The woman's head tilted slightly as she studied me, and for a moment, I feared she won't let me leave. Then, she stepped back, her eerie smile returning. "Very well, but you'll come back, won't you?" she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I then said, "Sure," but I didn't mean it at all. I said, "I'll be back." Then after that, I turned and walked briskly towards the door, my heart pounding. As I reached the hallway, her laughter echoed behind me, a cold and malevolent sound that made my skin crawl. I bolted out of the house and didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, hands trembling, and sped away from that nightmarish place. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the doorway, her hollow eyes watching me as I disappeared down the dark road. Once I reached the main street, I pulled over trying to calm my racing heart. What had just happened? Who was that woman? The rest of my shift was a blur as my mind kept drifting back to the old house and the sinister woman inside. When I finally got home, exhausted and shaken, I collapsed into bed. The next day, I told myself about the nightmarish encounter. They laughed it off, saying I must have been imagining things. Maybe they were right. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I had seen was real. To this day, I have never returned to that part of town, nor do I ever plan to. My name is Jason, and I'm 15 years old. Last month, while my parents and younger sister were away on a trip to Texas, I was left home alone. At first, I was thrilled by the freedom, endless movie marathons, and junk food galore. But one rainy night, everything changed, and the excitement turned into a nightmare. It was a stormy Friday evening. The rain hammered relentlessly against the windows as I spent most of the day gaming and texting friends. And by exactly 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I climbed under the covers and turned off the lights, and I tried to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic patter of rain. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise downstairs, muffled voices. My first thought was that my parents had returned early, but I quickly remembered they wouldn't be back until Monday. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The voice was faint, barely audible, but my curiosity got the best of me. I crept out of bed, moving cautiously towards my bedroom door. Peeking out into the dark hallway, I saw nothing but shadows. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint murmur from downstairs. Despite the gnawing fear in my stomach, I decided to investigate. I tiptoed down the stairs, each step a silent drumbeat of terror. When I reached the bottom, I paused to listen again. The voice was clearer now, but the words were still indistinct. It seemed to be coming from the living room. My heart raced as I took a deep breath and glanced towards the sound. Suddenly a loud bang echoed through the house, a door slamming shut. My blood turned to ice. I whipped around the corner and froze in horror. At the end of the hallway stood a shadowy figure, tall and cloaked in darkness. His features were obscure, but his presence was menacing, panic surged through me. Who was this person? And how did he get into my house? My first instinct was to flee. I dashed up the stairs, my heart pounding as I heard footsteps pounding behind me. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it, fumbling with my phone as I dialed 911. My hands were shaking as I explained the situation to the operator, my voice quivering with fear. She assured me that the police were on their way and instructed me to stay on the line. As I clutched the phone, I could hear the intruder moving around downstairs, my mind racing with dread about what he might be doing. I felt like an eternity before I finally heard a distant wail of sirens. The noises downstairs abruptly ceased, and an oppressive silence fell over the house. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock at the front door followed by voices. Thankfully, the police had arrived. I cautiously opened my bedroom door and made my way downstairs. 2 officers were in the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the dark. I recounted everything that had happened, my voice still trembling though. The officers conducted a thorough search of the house, but found no trace of the intruder. The front door was unlocked, but there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They took my statement and reassured me that they would patrol the area throughout the whole night. They advised me to stay with a neighbor or relative until my parents returned, but I refused to leave my home. They left me their contact information and promised to keep a close watch. After the police departed, I tried to calm my racing heart, but the fear lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow figure and his intentions. Why had he been in my house? What was he searching for? The questions haunted me as I lay awake, every creak and groan of the house amplifying my terror. When morning finally came, I felt a little better but remained shaken. I called my parents and told them what had happened. They were shocked and promised to cut their trip short and return home immediately. The following days were a blur. My parents arrived, and we had a new security system installed. The police continued their investigation, but they never found any leads. To this day, I don't know who that intruder was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget that night, the night I came face to face with the unknown and the terror that came with it. At 37 years old, I decided to attend my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport, rented a car, and embarked on a 35-minute drive to my hometown. The road took me through a desolate stretch of rural landscape where the emptiness and the shadowy woods felt unsettling. As I neared town, about 3 miles out, I spotted someone on the side of the road, waving frantically. I slowed down and recognized him as Jim, an old high school friend. We hadn't seen each other in 2 decades, but he looked almost the same, just a bit older. Jim hopped into the car, and we began catching up, reminiscing about our high school escapades. It was comforting to reconnect with someone from my past. As we approached town, I invited Jim to join me for a drink at the VFW hall. Jim declined, asking to be taken to the outskirts of town instead. I knew his parents used to live not far away from my grandmother's house, so I headed that way. Jim directed me to drop him off at a mobile home park on the edge of town. With a final friendly goodbye, he stepped out into the darkness and disappeared from view. Later that night at the VFW, I shared with my old classmates that I had just picked up Jim and dropped him off. The room fell eerily silent. Even the karaoke singer stopped mid-note. My cousin's face went pale as she told me, "Barb, Jim died in a car accident on that very curve 8 years ago. We all attended his funeral." My stomach churned with disbelief. I needed to process what I had just heard. Mumbling an excuse, I went outside to the car. Hopping a few deep breaths would help. As I sat in the driver's seat, I noticed a newspaper on the passenger side. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that it was a local paper from 8 years ago, featuring Jim's obituary on the front page. The obituary detailed Jim's fatal car crash, how he had lost control and rolled into a ditch, dying instantly. I couldn't comprehend it. How could I have just seen him? I was desperate for answers. The next morning, I visited Jim's old home. Jim's mother, visibly aged and worn by grief, answered the door. I recounted my bizarre encounter with Jim the night before. Her eyes widened and she invited me in, explaining that after Jim's death, many people claimed to have seen him around town, especially near the site of the crash. Some believe it was his relentless spirit unable to move on. I asked if she had experienced anything unusual herself. Tears welled up in her eyes as she confessed that sometimes she felt his presence in the house, hearing his favorite song play on the radio even when it was off. It was as if he was still there, watching over them. Leaving her house, I was filled with a mix of sorrow and bewilderment. That night, I couldn't sleep as my thoughts consumed me by the eerie encounter with Jim. I wondered if I had tried to convey something important, or if there was a reason he had appeared to me. As the reunion wrapped up and I drove back home, I slowed down when passing the spot where I had picked him up. The road was empty, but an icy chill ran down my spine. I still have that old newspaper with Jim's obituary, a haunting memory of that night. Whenever I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that there is more to this world than what meets the eye. Maybe Jim's appearance was a final goodbye or a sign of unfinished business. Whatever the case may be, I'll never forget that night and the chilling mystery it left behind. The idea of camping alone in the forest filled me with a thrill I hadn't felt in years. The thought of escaping the city's chaos and immersing myself in nature was enticing. One Friday afternoon, I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, and provisions and drove to the edge of the dark forest. As I parked and slung my backpack over my shoulders, a sense of adventure buzzed through me. The forest welcomed me with the rustling of tall trees and chirping birds. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the sun was casting a warm glow. As I was setting up a camp in a small clearing, the trees loomed overhead, and a gentle breeze carried out the scent of pine. I built a small campfire, its crackling flames promising warmth and comfort as night began to fall. As dusk enveloped the forest, an eerie silence settled in. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, staring at the star-filled sky, feeling a mix of solitude and contentment. But then, a rustle in the bushes shattered the call. My heart skipped a beat all of a sudden, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But the noise grew louder and more persistent. Anxiety crept over me as I sat up and strained my eyes into the encroaching darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence answered me. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the bushes, revealing nothing but swaying leaves. Trying to dismiss my unease, I added more wood to the fire and huddled closer to its warmth, though the sensation of being watched clung to me. Hours dragged on, and just as sleep began to claim me, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. My blood ran cold. This was no animal. Someone was approaching. I shouted again, "Who's there?" The forest remained silent. Grabbing a large stick for protection, I stood by the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then I saw it, a tall, shadowy figure emerging from the gloom. Just beyond the fire's reach, he stood there still, staring at me. I couldn't make out his features, but I felt his gaze like a physical presence. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to mask my terror. He didn't respond though, only continuing to watch me with an unsettling intensity. Panic surged through me. I had no idea who this man was or what he intended, but I knew I had to escape. I slowly backed towards my tent, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. Suddenly he began advancing towards me, his steps quick and purposeful. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted into the forest, my heart racing. The darkness was disorienting, and the branches clawed at my arms and face as I ran. I could hear him gaining on me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I stumbled over a root and fell, pain shooting through my ankle. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet, limping as quickly as I could. The moonlight through the trees guided me towards what I hoped was safety. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into a clearing and spotted a small cabin with lights on inside. I limped towards it, hanging on the door, shouting for help. Tears streamed down my face as an elderly man opened the door, startled by my frantic pleas. "There's someone after me. Please, let me in," I cried. He stepped aside, and I stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor. The man quickly shut and locked the door, peering out the window. "There is no one there," he said, turning to me with a look of concern. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded vigorously, still trembling. He was chasing me. The old man handed me a blanket, saying I could stay the night and they'd sort things out in the morning. I thanked him my voice barely a whisper. Unwrapped myself in the blanket, finally feeling a semblance of safety. The old man sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the door. Exhaustion soon overcame me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When morning arrived, the old man and I went back to my campsite. There was no sign of the stranger, but the terror of that night lingered. I packed up quickly and left the forest, vowing never to camp alone again. The peaceful solitude I had once longed for had become a nightmare I would never forget. It was a quite Thursday evening at St. Anne's mental health facility, a place steeped in years of troubled souls and unsettling occurrences. The sun had long set and the moon cast eerie shadows on the walls as I started my night shift. The facility, with its creaky floors and narrow hallways, seemed to exhale a sense of age and mystery. My shift began at 8 p.m., and the night was calm. I made my rounds, checking on patients and ensuring they were comfortable and had taken their medication. Everything seemed routine, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air, as if unseen eyes were watching me. Around midnight, while I was at the nurse's station updating patient records, the only light was from a dim disc lamp. Suddenly I heard a faint whisper. I paused, straining to make sense of it. The whisper was so soft, I thought it might be my imagination. I shrugged it off and continued my work, but then it came again, clearer this time, almost like someone softly calling my name. "Emily!" My heart began to race. I stood up and glanced around the empty hallway outside the station. The silence was unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks and decided to do another round. As I walked through the darkened hallways, the feeling of being watched intensified. Reaching room 307, where Mrs. Thompson, a typically quiet patient, resided, I noticed her doorway was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the window, her usual vacant stare replaced by an unsettling focus on the moon. She was humming a strange, unfamiliar tone. I gently touched her shoulder, and she turned to me with wide, fearful eyes. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The shadows, they came at night. They whispered. They want to take me." A chill ran down my spine as I tried to comfort her, but her words kept repeating. "The shadows, the shadows." Feeling more unsettled than ever, I left her room and headed back to the nurse station. As I walked, the lights flickered, and the whispering started again, louder this time. "Emily! Emily!" It echoed through the hallways, making my heart pound in my chest. When I reached the nurse's station, the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam offered little reassurance. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by multiple voices. "Emily, come play with us. Join us." A cold breeze brushed past me, and papers scattered across my desk. My flashlight flickered, and I caught glimpses of shifting shadows at the edge of the light. In a panic, I decided to check the security cameras. The monitors were in a small room next to the nurse's station. As I turned on the screens, most showed empty hallways and rooms, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the camera view of the hallway outside room 307, shadows moved. Dark, shifting forms creeping towards the nurse station. Towards me. I couldn't breathe. I watched in horror as the shadows drew nearer. I grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. The whispers intensified. "Emily, join us forever." I backed into a corner, clutching my flashlight. The shadows reached the door, and an icy chill enveloped me. The door creaked open, and the room darkened even further. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the shadows vanished. The whispering ceased. I stood in the blinding light, trembling and gasping for air. I had no idea what had just transpired, but I knew one thing. This was no ordinary place. Something malevolent lurked here, feeding on the fear of both patients and staff. The rest of the night was a blur. I somehow completed my shift, but the dread never left me. When morning arrived, I handed over to the day nurse and left the facility as quickly as possible. I didn't tell anyone what had just happened. I mean, who would believe me? That night marked a turning point for me. I realized that some things defy explanation and that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension. I never returned for another night shift at St. Anne's. The memory of that night lingers, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I can still hear the haunting whispers. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small cozy place that seemed perfect for me. The walls were painted a soothing blue and the big window in the living room lit in ample sunlight. After a long stint of sharing living spaces, having a place of my own felt like a luxury. One evening, after unpacking most of my belongings, I decided to unwind. I brewed a cup of tea, sank into the couch, and lost myself in a book. The apartment was quiet, save for the gentle tickling of the wall clock. As I read, the warmth of the tea and the comfort of the couch began to lull me to sleep. Just as I was on the brink of drifting off, an unnerving noise jolted me awake. It was a faint scratching sound, like someone lightly scraping something against my front door. My heart raced. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the sound persisted, this time louder and more deliberate, as if someone was trying to unlock the door. I put my book down and crept towards the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was shrouded in darkness and empty. I held my breath, waiting, but the noise ceased. Perhaps it was my imagination. Trying to regain my composure, I returned to the couch, but the unsettling sound wouldn't leave my mind. I switched on the TV for distraction, but even hours later, my nerves remained on edge. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. After brushing my teeth and changing into pajamas, I slipped under the covers. The bed was warm and inviting, and I soon fell asleep. In the dead of night, I was abruptly awakened. The scratching noise was back, louder and more frantic this time. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone to check the time, and it was 2:30 a.m. The sound grew more intense, accompanied by the rattling of the door handle, as if someone was trying to force it open. Panic surged through me. Should I call the police or try to scare them off by yelling? My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator answered calmly, assuring me that officers were on their way and advised me to stay quiet and keep calm. I clung to the phone, listening to the operator's reassuring voice as the scratching grew louder. I could now hear heavy breathing and a low, menacing voice muttering incomprehensible words. It felt like an eternity, but finally the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. The sound seemed to startle the intruder, and the rattling stopped, leaving an eerie silence. I stayed frozen in bed, terrified to move. After what felt like an eternity, a loud knock on the door jolted me. A voice announced there was the police. With trembling legs and a racing heart, I approached the door and opened it to find two serious-looking officers. I explained the situation and they quickly surveyed the apartment and hallway. Whoever it was, they're gone now, one officer said, but we'll stay here for a while, just to be sure. I felt a bit reassured by their presence. The officers patrolled the area for about an hour before leaving. They told me to call again if anything seemed amiss and then departed. I locked the door behind them and double-checked all the windows. Despite their assurances, unease settled over me. I returned to bed, but every creak and whisper had me on high alert. The thought of the intruder returning haunted me. The next day, I reported the incident to the building manager. They promised to review the security footage and improve hallway lighting. I also decided to invest in a stronger lock for my door. Days passed without any further incidents, but the sense of being watched never faded. Every night, I would hear unsettling noises, creaks, whispers, and soft footsteps, but when I investigated, nothing was there. Though I tried to move on, the fear lingered, always lurking in the back of my mind. I yearned for the day when I could feel safe in my own home again. For now, the memory of that night remained with me, a haunting reminder of an intruder who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. And though the police assured me he was gone, I couldn't shake the nagging worry of whether he might return or what he wanted in the first place. My name is Tom and I work as a delivery driver for a quaint diner called Maggie's Place. My shifts were typically uneventful until one chilling October night, just days before Halloween, when I encountered something I'll never forget. It was an unusually cold evening, the sky cloaked in thick, ominous clouds that obscured the moon. I was preparing to finish my shift when the phone rang with an order: a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake. Routine stuff, but the address was unfamiliar, leading me to a deserted street called Maple Avenue, a part of town I rarely visited. The drive to Maple Avenue felt longer than expected. The streets grew quieter and darker as I approached. Finally, I turned onto Maple Avenue and was immediately struck by the eerie silence. The street was deserted, not a single car was parked, and the houses looked dark and forsaken. I arrived at house number 103, a large, dilapidated mansion with peeling paint and broken windows. The overgrown yard and creaky gate added to the unsettling atmosphere. I walked up to the front door and knocked, the sound reverberating through the empty house. When no one answered, I knocked again, more forcefully this time. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a voice from above. "I'm coming," it said. I looked up to see a shadowy figure in the upper window. Although I couldn't make out the figure's face, I was relieved to know someone was home. I waited on the porch with the food, but no one appeared. I called out, "Hello? Your food is here," but only silence responded. I checked my phone to confirm the address and tried calling the number on the order slip, but it went straight to voicemail. As my unease grew, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around to see an elderly woman standing on the sidewalk, her expression one of concern. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked. "Yes, I have a delivery for this house," I replied, pointing to 103, but no one is answering the door. The woman's eyes widened in horror. "No one lives there. That house has been abandoned for years. It's haunted." A chill ran down my spine. "Haunted? Are you sure?" She nodded gravely. "People say they hear voices and see shadows in the windows, but it's been empty since the family that owned it died in a fire." I was stunned. The house looked like it had been deserted for a long time. I turned back to the house, feeling a growing sense of dread, asking myself only one question, and that is, who had placed that order? Deciding to leave the food in the porch, I started walking back to my car. Suddenly the voice came again, louder this time. "I'm coming." I spun around, but the porch was empty, and the house was silent. My heart racing, I jumped into my car and sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I returned to the diner Maggie, the owner noticed my pale face and asked what happened. I recounted the entire unsettling experience. She listened intently, then sighed. Maple Avenue, huh? I've heard stories about that place. It's been abandoned for over a decade. Must have been a prank call." "A prank call? It didn't feel like one. It felt too real." I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something supernatural had occurred. I finished my shift, but sleep eluded me that night as I replayed the voice, the shadow in the window, and the old woman's warning over and over. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. I researched the house at 103 Maple Avenue and found old newspaper articles about a fire that had destroyed the house 15 years ago. A family of 4 had perished in the blaze, and the house had remained vacant ever since. I still don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I've never returned to Maple Avenue. Each time I pass the part of town, a shiver runs down my spine, and whenever I hear someone say, "I'm coming," I can't help but remember that haunting night in the abandoned house with the shadowy figure in the window. On a chilly autumn evening, my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned factory on the edge of town. Rumors had swirled around this place for years, stories of eerie creatures and ghostly sightings. Despite our apprehensions, our curiosity got the better of us. Tristan, Bobby, Sarah, and I were determined to uncover the truth behind these chilling tales. The factory loomed before us, a massive crumbling structure with shattered windows and rusted metal doors. The wind howled through the empty halls, sending shivers down my spine. We squeezed through a gap in the fence and stepped inside. our flashlights casting long menacing shadows on the walls. "Let's check out the elevator shaft," Tristan suggested with his usual bravado, or perhaps recklessness. We followed him down the dark corridors. When we reached the shaft, Tristan peered into the abyss below. "I think I see something," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I leaned in, straining my eyes for a moment. I thought I saw a faint human-like silhouette standing in the darkness, but it vanished almost instantly. I tried to brush it off. "Probably just a trick of the light," I said, hoping to reassure myself and others. Bobby, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "You guys are imagining things," saying there's no such thing as ghosts or monsters. We moved on, exploring various rooms and floors of the factory. The place was a labyrinth of old machinery, broken furniture, and piles of debris. The air was thick with dust, and each step echoed ominously through the vast emptiness. As we made our way to the upper floors, Bobby suddenly froze, saying, "Did you hear that?" His voice a whisper. We all listened, holding our breath. There it was, a faint rustling sound like something skittering quickly across the floor. "It's probably just rats," Sarah said. Though her voice trembled, we pressed on, but a palpable sense of unease hung over us. In one of the larger rooms, we stumbled upon a makeshift camp, old blankets, empty cans, and a small fire pit. "Looks like someone been living here," I said. "Maybe it's just a homeless person," Tristan suggested. We decided it was time to leave, feeling we had seen enough. As we retraced our steps, Bobby suddenly pointed to a shadowy figure darting across the hallway ahead. It moved so fast it was almost a blur. "Did you see that?" he asked, his face ashen. "There is someone here," he exclaimed. We quickened our pace, hearts pounding. Just then, Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. We turned to see a dark figure standing at the end of the hall. Its eyes glowed eerily in the dim light. It was tall, thin, with long bony fingers. "Everybody run!" Tristan shouted, and we didn't need any further encouragement. We sprinted down the hall immediately, the figure closing in behind us. As we reached the stairs, I glanced back and saw it standing there, its eyes locked onto us, as if piercing right through our souls. We burst out of the factory, gasping for breath. We didn't stop running until we were safely back on the main road, far from that menacing building, panting and wide-eyed. We tried to make sense of what we had just encountered. "I could have been a person," I suggested weakly, though the figure's unnatural movement and glowing eyes had unsettled me deeply. Bobby nodded, still visibly shaken. "Maybe it didn't feel right," he admitted. Tristan, usually so confident, was uncharacteristically quiet. "I don't know what it was, but I don't want to go back there again." "Me neither," Sarah shivered. "That place is cursed." As we walked home, we tried to laugh off the experience, to make light of what we had seen. But deep down, we all know that something profoundly strange had happened that night. Even now, years later, when I hear strange noises in the dark or catch a shadow out of the corners of my eye, I remember those glowing eyes and the intense feeling of being watched. Some things are best left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved.